I'm watching with great interest the regular news we're getting lately about legislators on break who are doing exactly what they said they would do, repeal the Affordable Care Act, which they insist is unpopular and too expensive, and are facing at home frightened, furious constituents, their constituents, the ones who elected them, and a president who was very frank about his disdain for this Affordable Care Act and his intention to make it go away. Turns out that the citizens, even politically conservative ones, want access to health care protected by the government, facilitated by the government, and even if necessary, paid for by the government. Turns out that people remember the nightmares of unregulated health insurance, the denial of coverage, the lifetime limits reached by the age of 2 months or after one bout with cancer, the near impossibility of getting an individual plan at any price, the need to stay with your job for insurance reasons, the price increases year after year. It took the populace only a few years of experience with plans that actually offered insurance to come to depend on them. And they assumed that the politicians who filled the airwaves with their promises to repeal it were just full of hot air. And now they're scared and angry. And what was it that made them forget how important health care was and vote Republican anyway? The single most common reason people gave was abortion. They were afraid that the politicians who promised to improve rather than abolish the Affordable Care Act, that they depend on for their very lives, would bring on a Supreme Court that would continue to affirm Roe v. Wade, the decision which gave women the right to end an unwanted pregnancy for any reason up until the 26th week of pregnancy, and the right to end it later if necessary to preserve her life or health. Another way to put it is that Roe v. Wade ended mandatory motherhood in the United States. Because that is what you have if you don't have access to abortion for unwanted pregnancies. Even women who are celibate or lesbian can be raped. Without access to abortion, they are forced to go through pregnancy and childbirth, forced to undergo changes in their brains and bodies, which are so well defined, created by nature to prepare them for the motherhood they didn't choose. Even girls under the age of consent are regularly the victims of forced sex and would be forced to become mothers. Even the best forms of birth control fail regularly, especially for women in their 20s and women approaching menopause and women who need antibiotics at any time and women who are bigger than average. Anyway, 99% effective in each year of use is actually terrible odds over 30 years of use. And those who say just put the baby up for adoption and go on with your life are ignorant of the brain and body changes that take place during pregnancy. If you bring a baby to term, you're a mother. Even if you have a choice to give the baby up for an adoption, and a 50-year-old married working woman would probably not feel that she had that choice. But anyway, you don't forget. For almost all women, mandatory pregnancy means mandatory motherhood. That's a fact of life. And since in most of human history motherhood was mandatory, it's also the source of patriarchy. The widely assumed notion that men are more important, more reliable, and more privileged than women comes from the fact that through most of human history, women were weakened, sickened, and often killed by the fertility they couldn't control. Patriarchy is not actually about men's bigger biceps. It's about men taking advantage of women debilitated by pregnancy and childbirth and child raising. And it is as surely threatened by an end to mandatory motherhood as it is threatened by the idea that not all men need women and not all women need men, and by the idea that gender never was 100% binary. You're either a man or a woman, and seems to be getting more fluid in these latter days. Lots of issues in our changing world have captured the ire of those who who liked the great white fathers know best patriarchy that they believe is the best and natural and foundational way of this nation. The white part of that equation is important, and it does figure into the abortion debate in an ugly but peripheral way. Mostly the issue of abortion, though, is about patriarchy, about men wanting, needing, and legislating control over women. That's not all it's about. It's also about the hardwired human impulse to care for infants, an evolutionary necessity. Our species is born helpless and stays nearly helpless for 10 years, doesn't really finish developing until 25. For most of our existence on this planet, we were the endangered species. We've got genes for survival, and those include genes for caring for babies. And not just our own babies, but any critter with a big round head and great big beautiful eyes. Even cartoon characters drawn that way trigger our care. And there's very little as round-headed and big-eyed as a fetus, as we now see them in those beautiful ultrasounds floating in their little spaceship wombs. Nurturing these helpless creatures goes to the core of who we are as human beings. It's a human thing. Maybe not a human being yet, but clearly human potential. You can take your philosophical pick. Believe it or not, it doesn't really matter. But we want to preserve this humanity, this impulse to care. We want to protect human life, and that's all a good thing. It's just not the only good thing. The other thing about these achingly beautiful creatures is that they're not floating around in little spaceships. They are floating around in somebody else's body. And whatever we want to say about the right to life that a fetus has by virtue of its humanity or its potential or its innocence or its genes, it does not have the right to commandeer somebody else's body. Because human beings, and we have no doubt about the human rights of the pregnant woman, do we? Do we? Human beings have the right to their own bodily integrity, a right to privacy, as the Supreme Court somewhat confusingly named it. This right to privacy, to bodily integrity, to choose if and who to give one's body to, is fundamental to freedom. And every patient who dies awaiting an organ transplant, and plenty do, dies because they cannot commandeer another person's body, not even a drop of their blood. This issue's been tested in court over the years. A typical case would go something like this. A child is in need of a kidney transplant, say, without which she will die, and the matching tissue she needs is rare. Her mother is willing, but tissue doesn't match, and so she asks the child's father, her now estranged ex-husband, to be tested. He refuses. She takes him to court. The court reluctantly cannot issue the order. It is so obvious to us that a man cannot under any circumstances be compelled to give even the smallest part of his body to save the life of even his own child. We can condemn him as a cad, but to compel him would take away something that's essential to his humanity, his basic freedom. The courts always say in these cases that a person's fundamental and sacred right to freedom means nothing if it does not mean the right to decide whether or not to donate a part of one's body to somebody else. They always say that the human right to life does not extend to the right to appropriate somebody else's body, even your parents. According to the thinking of the current administration, you don't even have a right to life if you can't afford to pay for the care you need. And that's why all the rhetoric about when human life begins is a big red herring. It doesn't matter when human life begins. Whatever you think a fetus is, it doesn't have the right to use somebody else's body without their consent, even if it will die. All the case law that I'm aware of about this involves men. And naturally, all the cases where the law compels a woman to continue to give her body to a fetus were all about women. And it's not just sexism that's going on. It's also that pregnancy comes all too naturally, as most of us know, through our 20s and 30s, and is so often a joyous event, and by so many considered a woman's unique contribution to the ongoing life of the species. And with all that good feeling in the background, it's apparently impossible for many people to grasp that an unwillingly, unhappily pregnant woman has been invaded and is being asked to do something that in all other cases would be voluntary and heroic: support another life with their very body. There are lots of reasons that we don't quite get this, even after 40 years of trying, but most of it's patriarchy. Patriarchy, which has given almost all the blame and shame of the negative consequences of sexuality to women. Patriarchy, which knows to the core of its bones that if women can't control their fertility, they can't control their lives, and if they can't control their lives, they can't really be treated as the equals of men who imagine that they are the masters of their fate. It's no accident that the great flashpoints of the culture wars have been abortion, gay rights, and now transgender rights. Abortion rights empower women to control their lives and live fully in the world and not just in the home, and that is uber threatening. The normalization of the lives of women who choose to form families and express their sexuality without men, and the normalization of men who, in the patriarchal model, choose to act like women, is uber threatening to the patriarchy. And the idea that gender, maleness and femaleness, is not biologically assigned at birth but can be ambiguous or emotional or changeable, that's the most recent blow to the patriarchy. When you add to that the assaults on white privilege and white power from a growing population of people of color, and the assaults on Christian privilege from both a shrinking population of Christians within and a growing population of persons deeply committed to other gods, you have what we've got now. And I think that patriarchy's war is going to be fought on two fronts: abortion and illegal immigration. Because those are the two situations in which the victims, the unwillingly pregnant women and the undocumented immigrants, are blamed by many people for their predicament and are considered morally suspect. And in both cases, the conservative solutions to these problems are going to cause unintended consequences that will clarify the situation to the better. Because we actually do need immigrants and are going to have to regularize their status. And we actually do need access to abortion, men and women, liberals and conservatives, rich and poor. And why? Because when a woman is unwillingly pregnant, her right to freedom, which is nothing if it's not the right to decide whether she wants to offer her body to a developing fetus, clashes with the absolute need of that fetus to use her body to sustain its life. And the willful ignorance of a remarkable number of lawmakers to the contrary, this happens regularly in cases of rape, even when the woman has used the best available forms of birth control, even when she is married, 50 years old and responsible, all those traits that lawmakers would wish that would go away so that they can blame the need for abortion on irresponsible, promiscuous teenagers. But you know, even if it was a good idea to punish irresponsible, promiscuous teenagers for their sins, we would not sentence them or their boyfriends to donate much-needed kidneys to save lives. The right to life and the right to liberty clash regularly in this world. And actually, when they clash, it's almost always liberty, not life, that wins out. Give me liberty or give me death, right? That's sort of our national anthem for America, the basis of the best wars we ever fought. England was not threatening our lives when we went to war in 1776. That was a war for independence, for freedom, not a war for survival that all those people died in. The Civil War, the costliest war in American history in terms of loss of life, was fought either for the freedom of slaves or for the freedom of the southern states, depending on which side is writing the history, but both sides were fighting, dying, and killing for freedom, not life. We spent almost all the fight about abortion arguing about whether a fetus should be accorded full human rights, as if that would automatically mean that abortion should be prohibited. Both sides have participated in this. The pro-life side has cared only about the life of the fetus and, tellingly, has only cared about the life of the fetus not to be aborted, not whether it should live as a 2-year-old or a 10-year-old or as a 70-year-old. The pro-choice side picked a bad word, a frivolous word, to message their intuition that mandatory motherhood is not good for anybody and is a horrifying intrusion on the human right of a woman to her own body. Choices for what color of shoes you wear, what kind of vacation you take, what's the sauce for your taco. But what they meant to say was the right to life does not in any other instance mean the right to appropriate another person's body. Human beings, if they are to be called free, must be free to offer or refuse to use their bodies to serve others. And they so often do. And it is so wonderful to see. This incredible, inconvenient, painful, life-changing, miraculous whole-body donation of my freedom to the baby inside me that is pregnancy is taken for granted by most people as just the way things are supposed to be. And they think that Roe v. Wade somehow violated the way things should be, when actually it was a very carefully, wisely drawn compromise in what's fundamentally an insolvable conflict of the human rights to life and freedom. Women who are unwillingly pregnant may end the pregnancy. After that, up to 26 weeks. After that, barring some tragic development, they must carry the baby to term. If anyone were actually willing to risk compromise, that time probably should be shortened, because in the last 40 years, the age of viability has gone down. And there are both moral and practical and humanitarian reasons that abortions after the age of viability are problematic. Women who are unwillingly pregnant know what's happening to them. They know what they're giving up. They know what a big deal this is, this affront to their personhood, this violation of their freedom. That's why they've been willing to do everything over the centuries, from swallowing ergot and dying in dreadful pain, to crossing borders and risking infections, to jail and shame, to end their unwanted pregnancies. Those women know that a pregnancy is like a kidney donation. They know that if they can't do it in love, they shouldn't be forced to do it. And also, like anyone ever asked to give more than they could, who had to say no to the legitimate need of another, they feel a twinge, or more than a twinge, of sadness and shame about their predicament and their decision. So we don't talk about this very much. And the reality that it happens to a lot of people is left out of the public discourse. I don't want to leave it out of this one. This isn't an academic sermon about something that happens to other people that we should look upon humanely. This is something that has happened or will happen to 1 in 3 women and the men who love them during their fertile years. Me, you, your daughter, your girlfriend, your wife, your mother, and all those Catholic and conservative and evangelical friends in almost equal measure. And that's why conservatives should take a good look at the damage they're now taking on as they attempt to dismantle the supposedly hated, disastrous Affordable Care Act. They're suddenly realizing that people needed that law, and that remanding the whole thing back to the states might mean energizing a lot of change in state houses that would be to their detriment. That will also be the cost of dismantling Roe v. Wade, if it happens. Although there's the added benefit in this case for liberals that even rich people with Cadillac health plans still become accidentally pregnant, and they don't, in their heart of hearts, believe in mandatory motherhood either. Neither do I. Neither do you. Mandatory motherhood is an assault on our basic humanity, on the integrity of motherhood itself, which is a gift of heart and not a forced labor, and on the basic freedom that we understand makes us who we are.